a country with the world's largest oil reserves. A people caught between economic collapse, political instability, and wars of interest between the great powers. And now Trump's new move against Venezuelan oil, 25% tariffs. This decision will have a direct impact not only on Venezuela, but also on global oil markets, U.S. trading partners, and energy security. So what is behind this step? How will these sanctions change the balance between the U.S., China, Russia, and Europe? Let's take a look at the developments together.
That the president is going to impose what they're calling secondary sanctions on Venezuela, secondary tariffs, I should say, on Venezuela, using the tariffs as if they are
51 past the hour. Breaking this morning, President Trump announcing the U.S. will be levying a secondary tariff on Venezuela.
The U.S. will impose a 25% tariff on any country that buys oil and gas from Venezuela.
You saw what happened today with Venezuela. We did something with Venezuela, which is long in the making.
Since the first months of 2025, the Donald Trump administration has been taking aggressive steps in its trade policies, continuing to make shocking moves on the world stage. The most striking recent development has been the White House's decision to impose harsh tariffs on Venezuelan oil and the countries that buy it. In this case, the president posting on social media, any country that purchases oil and gas from Venezuela will be forced to pay a tariff of 25%. Anyone who supports the Nicolas Maduro regime and its oil revenues will face a 25% tariff, President Trump announced, sending global energy markets into an uproar. This harsh announcement is a threat to the already fragile Venezuelan economy and to countries that want to trade oil with it. Moreover, the decision is motivated by U.S. national security and foreign policy interests, with Trump emphasizing that the Maduro regime has committed human rights abuses and corruption and portraying Venezuela as a threat in the neighborhood. In short, the U.S. has opened a new front in global trade by announcing that it will penalize states that choose to buy Venezuelan oil with tariffs as high as 25%. Even if it does not impose direct sanctions on them. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Venezuelan oil and gas exports reached $5.6 billion in 2024. This is a rather high figure. But despite this, Venezuela faces great difficulties in the global market due to U.S. sanctions. So what happened today with Venezuela? We did something with Venezuela, which is long in the making. U.S. President Donald Trump has issued a stern warning to countries that buy oil from Venezuela, blaming the Maduro administration and the Tren de Aragua gang. Trump said that tariffs of up to 25% could be imposed on all goods coming to the U.S. from countries that buy oil from Venezuela. Criminals and murderers are being deliberately sent to America, he said, emphasizing that national security is under threat. The Departments of State, Treasury, Commerce and Homeland Security, as well as the U.S. Trade Representative, will decide how the tariffs will be applied. The measure will expire 1 year after the last oil import from Venezuela, or at an earlier date to be determined by the Trump administration. To better understand the developments, let's take a look at Venezuela's oil history. Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. However, instead of developing the country, this wealth has plunged it into a deep economic and political crisis. Having built an oil-dependent economy since the 1920s, Venezuela has become vulnerable to price fluctuations. Poor governance, misguided economic policies, and political instability have turned the country into a petrostate, an oil-dependent state with a weak economy. Overdependence on oil has hindered Venezuela's economic diversification and made the country vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. With the collapse of oil prices in 2014, Venezuela's economy began to collapse. A sharp decline in production, high inflation, and shortages of basic necessities deepened the crisis. At the same time, the U.S. tightened sanctions against Venezuela, further weakening the country's ties to the financial system. On the other hand, one of the toughest U.S. moves against Venezuela was the sanctions imposed by the Donald Trump administration in 2019. Trump's announcement that he would impose a 25% tariff on any country that bought oil from Venezuela led Venezuela to lose its biggest customers and to switch its oil exports largely to countries such as China, Russia, and Iran. However, these countries also faced U.S. pressure, and Venezuela's oil revenues declined rapidly. As a result of the sanctions, PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, was unable to maintain its production capacity. Investment in the oil sector came to a standstill, and Venezuela was largely disabled in the global energy market. The Biden administration temporarily lifted sanctions against Venezuela in 2023 but reinstated them in April 2024, accusing the Maduro government of failing to hold fair elections. Despite this, oil continued to flow to the U.S. thanks to a joint venture license that allowed Chevron to produce oil in Venezuela. The Trump administration was planning to revoke this license on April 3rd, but after a meeting with Chevron CEO Mike Wirth, the Treasury Department announced that the license was extended until May 27th. According to analysts, the cancellation of Chevron's operating license could lead to a decline of about 200,000 barrels per day in Venezuela's production. In global markets, this tariff announcement created a serious shock. Oil prices started to rise on concerns that Venezuelan supply would be further restricted. Some analysts said, if this decision becomes permanent, OPEC Plus countries may review their production figures, and there may be imbalances on the demand side. Especially U.S. media outlets also attribute Trump's move to election calculations. In the U.S., President Trump is trying to consolidate his voter base by maintaining his tough foreign policy line, while at the same time hoping to gain an advantage for American oil companies. With his move in Venezuela, Trump also intends to consolidate his leadership in the Central and South American markets, some commentators add. But there is also the possibility of a boomerang effect. Countries that would be deterred from buying Venezuelan oil because of tariffs could turn to other energy suppliers in the long run, undermining U.S. diplomatic relations. Tensions between Venezuela and the Trump administration are not limited to energy policy. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has announced that under a new agreement with the United States, Venezuela will continue to readmit migrants fleeing the country. We will continue to rescue our citizens held in U.S. prisons, Maduro said. However, the timing of this agreement is remarkable. Venezuela halted repatriation flights in March, a decision that came after the United States revoked Chevron's license to export Venezuelan oil. Caracas strongly condemned the move. Trump's special envoy, Richard Grenell, brokered the first migrant repatriation deal, announcing that Venezuela had agreed to take back its citizens illegally in the U.S., including members of the Tren de Aragua gang. But when Venezuela halted the deportation flights, the Trump administration sent 238 Venezuelans to El Salvador on March 15th. They were detained in a high-security prison. The U.S. authorities have not made an official statement on the identities of the deportees or their criminal connections. The impact of U.S. sanctions is not limited to Venezuela. This situation is also causing serious fluctuations in the global oil market. Oil prices continue to rise due to supply concerns. In particular, the U.S. announcement of tariffs on countries importing crude oil from Venezuela caused anxiety in the global market. While this development strengthened the expectation that supply may tighten, oil prices rose for the fifth consecutive day. Brent crude oil rose to $73.36 per barrel during the day, up 0.6%. Similarly, U.S. West Texas intermediate crude oil rose 0.6% to 69.52. Analysts noted that the U.S. tariff moves supported prices, but these gains remained limited due to OPEC Plus's steps to increase production in May. Global oil prices tend to increase in the short term after this latest decision. This step taken by Trump within the framework of his economic nationalism policy leads the world oil trade into uncertainty. If Europe, China, or other countries take the risk of buying Venezuelan oil, they will have to pay a serious price in their trade with the U.S. This is leading to supply concerns around the world. Sanctions on Russia, restrictions on Iran, now a de facto embargo on Venezuela, the world's oil supply could become even tighter, which would push up prices, some analysts warn. OPEC members are also closely watching developments. Saudi Arabia and its allies may develop strategies such as increasing or cutting production to protect their market share. In addition, shale oil producers in the U.S. could benefit from higher global prices. Some argue that by taking this step, Trump is trying to send the message that I support American oil companies in domestic politics. On the other hand, U.S. President Donald Trump plans to introduce a new series of tariffs globally on April 2nd, which he calls reciprocal tariffs. He said the U.S. will increase tariffs on other countries to match their duties, taking into account other behaviors that affect trade, such as tariffs and currency manipulation. Trump has begun calling today Liberation Day, but experts warn that this strategy could undermine the U.S. dollar's global strength. It's unclear whether this strategy will be effective, given that even existing secondary sanctions are not fully implemented. said Daniel Tannenbaum of consulting firm Oliver Wyman. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, using tariffs instead of sanctions could increase U.S. economic pressure while preserving the dollar's position. So, how will Venezuela's biggest oil customers, especially China and Russia, respond to these new regulations? Venezuelan oil is of strategic importance for China. In 2024, Venezuela produced 921,000 barrels of crude oil per day, of which 351,000 barrels were exported to China. China is Venezuela's largest oil customer, and this dependence is directly targeted by U.S. sanctions. If China continues to import oil from Venezuela, the U.S. is likely to make this trade more difficult. Moreover, the Trump administration has imposed a 20% tariff on Chinese goods and a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports. If China continues to buy oil from Venezuela, these tariffs could rise even higher. China's foreign ministry reacted strongly to the U.S. move. Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun accused Washington of interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs and called for the unilateral sanctions to be lifted. Guo said there is no winner in the trade war. Increased tariffs will lead to greater losses for American businesses and consumers, Guo said, making Beijing's stance against the U.S. clear. While these developments have exacerbated the existing economic tensions between China and the U.S., Venezuelan oil has become one of the new fronts in the global trade war. It remains to be seen how Russia, as one of the countries supporting the Maduro administration, will respond to this step by the U.S. But is it possible to escape the oil addiction that is dragging countries into a trade crisis? Oil and natural resources can contribute greatly to a country's economy. However, when mismanaged, this wealth can lead to economic imbalances and political instability. So why are some countries free from this dependence while others face economic hardship? For example, Norway was a country with strong institutions, and this infrastructure was already in place when oil was discovered. This allowed it to diversify its economy and maintain steady growth by managing its resources in a balanced way. Today, Norway derives most of its income from areas other than oil. However, if a country acquires oil wealth without building strong institutions and infrastructure, governance problems become inevitable. The most important strategy for such countries is to channel oil revenues into long-term development. This means investing in infrastructure, training the workforce, and supporting the private sector. For this, transparency plays a critical role. Many oil-rich countries have set up sovereign wealth funds to manage their revenues. These funds are being used to make the economy more balanced. Globally, these funds are estimated to reach $11 trillion by 2023. On the other hand, other countries in Latin America are also uncomfortable with this decision. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile were already turning to various sources to meet their energy needs, and Venezuelan oil was seen as a potential option. These tariff threats could lead countries in the region to distance themselves from the U.S. in foreign policy. Mexico also has a trade agreement with the U.S. under NAFTA, now USMCA, and is concerned that the tariff move could affect it as well. Even though Mexico does not trade oil with Venezuela on a large scale, such a heavy tariff policy by the U.S. is causing unease across the region. Petrodiplomacy has the power to change the geopolitical balance in Latin America. Thus, the Venezuela oil tariff decision opens a new chapter in Trump's America First approach. Wherever in the world we see oil being bought from Maduro, the U.S. will wave its tariff sword. This means Washington will use its commercial and diplomatic power to the fullest. Critics are united in the view that waging a multi-front trade war in this way would alienate U.S. allies and damage the global economic recovery. It is difficult to predict how it will play out. Historical experience shows that such radical steps often have unintended consequences. For now, the only clear picture is that global oil markets are reacting to this development. Tensions in international relations are rising, and Venezuela is once again caught in the middle of a great power arm wrestling match. On the other hand, the world is moving away from fossil fuels. The transition to renewable resources such as solar and wind is accelerating. This will force oil-dependent countries to diversify their economies. This process will be especially challenging for struggling countries like Venezuela. Given the current economic and political conditions, it is unlikely that Venezuela will be able to diversify into alternative sectors without getting its oil sector back on its feet. However, changing energy trends and international pressures will inevitably force countries to find new solutions. The future looks brighter for countries that invest in economic diversification and sustainable energy policies. Will Venezuela be able to keep up with this change? Or will it repeat the mistakes of the past? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Thank you for tuning in.